"Ms. Ellis," the judge snapped from the bench, "is that really how you choose to appear in my courtroom?" The sea-green scrubs Monique had worn through 12 hours of trauma care suddenly felt heavier under the weight of every eye in the room. But when she lifted her chin and replied, calm, unwavering, the silence that followed shook the courthouse more than any gavel ever could. Monique Ellis stood just outside courtroom 2C, her hand resting lightly on the cool metal handle. Her sea-green scrubs were wrinkled, the collar of her top slightly stretched from 12 hours of non-stop motion. Her Reeboks, once white, were now a dull gray smudged with the faint traces of antiseptic and hallway dust. The ID badge clipped to her chest swayed slightly as she took a breath, steadying herself. She hadn't slept in nearly 20 hours. The adrenaline from the trauma shift had long since faded, replaced by that familiar blend of weariness and resolve. She hadn't come here to make a statement. She hadn't even had time to think. But when you've held a stranger's life between your palms at 3 a.m, showing up in clean clothes feels like a luxury you stop expecting. Inside, the courtroom was buzzing. Attorneys rustled papers, a few jurors chatted in hushed tones, and the gallery had the low hum of people not quite sure why they were paying attention yet. But attention shifted the moment she entered. A black woman in hospital scrubs, dark circles under her eyes, ponytail barely holding on, walking toward the front of a courtroom in Mississippi that made people look. They didn't mean to, not all of them. But Monique had learned years ago that people always notice when you show up looking like you don't belong. She was halfway to the witness stand when the judge's voice cracked across the room. "Ms. Ellis," Judge Everett Langston said, not bothering to look up from his monitor, "is that really how you choose to appear in my courtroom?" A few people turned toward her, some with mild interest, others with amusement. One man in the back let out a short breath of a laugh before quickly covering his mouth. Monique stopped. She didn't flinch. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was clear and grounded. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I came straight from my shift. I didn't want to be late." Judge Langston looked up now. His face was square, stern, framed by graying hair that had been clipped to military precision. He tilted his head slightly, squinting. "This is a courtroom," he said, "not a trauma center. You're here to testify, not to clock in at St. Luke's. Show some respect." The way he said it wasn't loud, but it cut like it was meant to. It wasn't just a correction, it was a message. Public. Intentional. The room quieted a little more. Monique felt the moment settle around her like heat. She could have apologized. She could have lowered her head. But she had spent the night keeping a man's heart from stopping while his children sobbed outside the trauma bay. She had run a crash cart down a hallway, given compressions until her arms shook, and comforted a mother who had just learned her teenage son wouldn't wake up. Respect didn't come from appearances. It came from action. She took one step forward, then another. Her voice was steady, no louder than before. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, "these scrubs aren't disrespectful. They're clean. And they represent every person I fought to keep alive last night." Silence. Even the bailiff shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward the judge. Monique clasped her hands in front of her. She wasn't trying to win anyone over. She just wanted the room to understand that truth didn't wait for makeup or ironed clothes. Some of those people, she added, ended up in courtrooms like this because someone failed them. No one moved. Not the attorneys. Not the clerk. Not even Judge Langston. Then, from the gallery, a single pair of hands clapped, once, twice, followed by another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rebellious. It was acknowledgement. Within seconds, half the room was standing. Not cheering. Just rising. Quiet, reverent, as if the air had shifted and they all knew it. Monique didn't smile. She didn't look around. She simply walked to the witness stand and took her seat, her shoulders relaxed but unbent. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, who now sat back in his chair, hands folded at his chest, silent. Behind Monique's exhaustion was the weight of a night most people in that room couldn't imagine. And she'd brought it with her, whether they wanted it or not. She didn't come to perform. She came because someone needed her voice, and she wasn't about to let her uniform be louder than the truth she carried. What the judge hadn't realized, what no one had realized until that moment, was that this wasn't a woman who needed the courtroom's permission to speak. She had earned her voice the hard way, and it was already speaking volumes. The courtroom's echo faded, but the weight of Monique Ellis's presence lingered like a held breath. She sat at the witness stand with her back straight and hands folded, the sea green of her scrubs now a quiet symbol that no one dared question out loud. Judge Everett Langston hadn't said another word since the applause, his gavel untouched, his mouth tight. But beneath his composed surface, something had shifted. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he had been reminded that respect could walk into his courtroom in sneakers and tired eyes, and not ask for permission to be taken seriously. But before she spoke another word, before the jury even knew her name or why she was there, Monique's story had already begun 12 hours earlier, in a place far messier and louder than this courtroom would ever allow. It was 3:04 a.m. at St. Luke's Regional Trauma Center in Jackson, Mississippi, when Monique slammed her palm against the red emergency button and barked out, "Get respiratory in here, stat." Blood was pooling fast beneath a young man's torso. A gunshot wound to the chest, mid-thoracic cavity, likely clipped a lung. She didn't need imaging to know they were running out of time. "He's crashing," someone called out. She was already at the crash cart, gloves on, suction in hand. A nurse younger than her fumbled with the AP dose, trembling. "Hey," Monique said firmly, not unkindly. "Look at me. You're okay. Now draw it up again." The girl nodded, blinking fast. Monique turned back to the patient, whose lips were now dusky blue. She compressed, counted, called vitals, shouted updates to the trauma surgeon as he arrived pulling his gown on midrun. The noise in Trauma Bay 3 was organized chaos, but Monique's voice never shook. It never needed to. An hour later, after the boy was stabilized and taken to surgery, she stepped into the staff break room and let herself breathe for half a second. She peeled off her gloves. Her hands trembled now, not from fear, but fatigue. Her body wanted to stop. Her feet screamed inside the soles of her Reeboks. But that's when the call came in from charge. "Monique," her supervisor said. "You've been subpoenaed." "Tonight?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "This morning. 8 a.m. Crescent Pines case." The Powell report. The air shifted around her. Monique didn't blink. Just nodded. "I'll make it," she said. 2 weeks earlier, Miss Ernestine Powell had arrived from Crescent Pines Care Home. She was 87. Nonverbal. Bedbound. And broken in a way that no chart could soften. Monique remembered the moment clearly. The EMTs had wheeled her in like she was made of spun glass, terrified of hurting her more. One of them, an older black man with kind eyes, had leaned toward Monique and said quietly, "This ain't no fall." Monique hadn't needed convincing. She had seen it too many times, bruises that didn't match the angles, bones broken in ways no slip could explain, skin that had gone too long without water or dignity. Ernestine's pelvis was fractured. She was severely dehydrated. Pressure ulcers on both hips. The smell alone had told Monique more than the intake paperwork ever would. The night she treated her, Monique had stayed 4 hours past shift change. She documented everything. She flagged inconsistencies. She filed a formal incident report, even knowing it would mean testifying. She didn't do it for Ernestine's family, there was none. No visitors came. No emergency contacts. Just one woman, forgotten by a system and handed off like a burden. Monique couldn't forget her. That's why, by 7:15 a.m., with her shift technically over but her duty far from done, she had washed her hands, swiped the smear of iodine from her forearm, tossed her hoodie over her scrubs, and headed to court without even stopping at home. She hadn't looked in the mirror, hadn't checked her face. She didn't need to. Her story wasn't about presentation, it was about truth. Now, seated under oath, with the gallery watching and the judge adjusting his collar in uncomfortable silence, Monique spoke. My name is Monique Ellis. I've been a trauma nurse at St. Luke's for 17 years. On April 12th, I treated Miss Ernestine Powell after she was transferred from Crescent Pines Care Home. She paused, not for effect, but to let her breath catch. Her injuries included a fractured pelvis, severe dehydration, and stage 3 pressure ulcers. The home reported she had fallen trying to reach the bathroom on her own. But Miss Powell was nonverbal. She was also bedbound. She couldn't walk. She couldn't stand. Her voice didn't waver. The defense attorney, a man named Carson Dillard, stood and raised an eyebrow. Ms. Ellis, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, are you a forensic expert? No, sir, Monique said. Just a nurse who's seen too many of the same injuries explained with too many different lies. A low murmur spread through the room. Carson pressed on. So you're suggesting the staff at Crescent Pines intentionally harmed the patient? I'm saying, Monique replied, that what I saw doesn't match what I was told. And when you see the same patterns over and over, it stops being an accident and starts looking like neglect. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. But the words landed like a dropped weight. Even the jury leaned in. Carson shifted in place. Isn't it possible, he tried, that you're letting your emotions interfere with objectivity? Monique looked directly at him. I've worked too many nights watching people die because others overlook the signs. My job isn't to make assumptions. It's to notice what everyone else ignores. Miss Powell didn't fall. She was failed. The room quieted again. Even Judge Langston, who had earlier bristled at the sight of her scrubs, sat with his mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on the witness box. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. Because deep down, a part of him, a buried part raised on order and command, was beginning to understand that this woman in wrinkled cotton and worn sneakers wasn't just telling a story. She was shifting the ground beneath their feet. Carson cleared his throat. No further questions. Monique nodded, stood, and walked back to her seat behind the prosecutor's table, her head level, her steps slow but firm. Testimonies followed, facility records, witness statements, expert reviews, but none carried the same quiet gravity. The kind built not from credentials, but from countless nights spent choosing care over comfort, truth over rest. Behind Monique's silence now sat years of choices no courtroom could quantify. The jury watched her differently. Even the gallery sat still, as if trying to process what respect actually looked like. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't a nurse defending her uniform. It was a woman defending those who couldn't speak for themselves. And she had done it not with fanfare, but with facts, delivered in scrubs, unpolished and unafraid. 2 days later, while courtroom 2C filled once again with the sound of rustling papers and low murmurs, Monique Ellis was nowhere near the courthouse. The verdict was coming in, and the prosecution team sat poised, glancing toward the double doors as if half expecting Monique to walk in again with her scrubs and quiet fire. But Monique was 4 miles away, standing at bed 7 in the trauma unit at St. Luke's Regional, adjusting the oxygen flow for a woman in her 60s whose chest pain had spiked during rounds. Her badge hung lopsided, her fingers moved with mechanical confidence, and her eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, were fully focused. She hadn't forgotten about the trial, not even for a second. But people here needed her. And unlike in courtrooms, no one in trauma waited for a verdict. Life just kept showing up. At 3:26 p.m., the jury foreman read the decision aloud, guilty on all counts, gross negligence, elder abuse, and falsification of medical records. The air in the room stiffened. The nursing supervisor from Crescent Pines sat motionless, eyes downcast. A man from the facilities board rubbed his temple with a trembling hand. It was a quiet fall for a place that had hidden behind policies and signatures. But Monique wasn't there to watch it collapse. She was changing in 4-line and listening to a young mother cry over her son's sudden seizure. No one around her clapped. No one mentioned her name. And that was just fine with her. The impact of her testimony hadn't been loud, it had been surgical. Days passed. The news ran a small segment on the trial. A few local headlines named Monique in passing, calling her a critical witness in a case that had captivated courtroom observers. She didn't read them. She hadn't testified for recognition. She'd done it because Miss Ernestine Powell had no one else left. And when a woman like that comes through your care, silent and bruised, you don't let the world forget her story just because it's uncomfortable. The first ripple found Monique late one night. It was just past 11, and she was riding the staff elevator up from the cafeteria with a styrofoam container of meatloaf she'd barely touched. As the doors slid open on the fourth floor, a woman with tired eyes and a blue tote bag stepped in. She looked at Monique for a long second. Were you in that trial last week? Monique blinked. Yes. The woman hesitated. My father was in Crescent Pines. He died there last year. I always knew something felt off, but no one ever listened to me. She swallowed hard. But I saw your testimony. I just wanted to say, thank you. Monique offered a quiet nod. The elevator hummed in the silence. I'm sorry about your father, she said softly. The woman's eyes shimmered. You spoke for people like him. That mattered. Then she stepped off on the fifth floor, and the doors closed. The elevator kept moving, but something in Monique stayed still. That same week, a nursing student in bright white clogs and oversized scrubs approached her in the hallway. Ms. Ellis? Monique glanced up from the chart. Yes? I'm sorry, I'm in my second semester and I saw the court video. I've been so burned out lately, questioning if I made the right choice. But after watching you, I remembered why I started. Monique gave her a small smile. You're allowed to question it, she said. It means you still care. The girl beamed. Thank you. Seriously. And then she was gone, sneakers squeaking down the hall. Monique returned to her patient, but her steps felt lighter somehow. The hospital had always been a place where no one noticed you until something went wrong. Nurses were background noise, called angels when things got bad, but rarely seen as human when the shift ended. But now, something was different. Not with everyone. Not all at once. But occasionally someone would pause when they saw her badge, linger just long enough to wonder. And Monique could feel it, the shape of their gaze had changed. One morning, just before her shift began, she received a message on her hospital-issued phone from a number she didn't recognize. It read, Ms. Ellis, this is Angela Bryant, clerk to Judge Langston. The judge has requested to speak with you privately if you're open to it. Monique stared at the message for a long moment. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Not out of spite. Just out of fatigue. What more could possibly be said? But something tugged at her. Not curiosity, but clarity. She didn't need an apology. But maybe he did. A few days later, during her off hours, she walked through the same courthouse doors she'd entered in her scrubs. This time, she wore jeans, a soft gray top, and the same Reeboks, still scuffed. She didn't dress differently for the occasion. She didn't need to. They met in a small chamber, quiet and sunlit through tall windows. Judge Langston stood when she entered. He didn't speak at first. Just looked at her with an expression stripped of ceremony. Thank you for coming, he said. She nodded once. You asked to see me. He cleared his throat. I've been on this bench for nearly 3 decades. Before that, a prosecutor. Before that, military. Respect, to me, has always meant uniformity. Discipline. Structure. He paused. But I watched that courtroom stand for you. And I realized I may have confused appearance with respect. Monique didn't flinch. She didn't need to fill the silence. You were right to say what you said, he continued. I saw defiance at first. What I didn't see was the years behind your words. The nights. The loss. The fight. He looked up at her then. I was wrong. And I owe you an apology. Not because of how I made the courtroom look, but because I didn't listen before you spoke. Monique simply replied, "Thank you for saying that." He nodded. There was nothing else to settle. No handshake. No exchange of favors. Just truth. And that was more than enough. She left the courthouse with no fanfare. No camera crews. No interviews. The world went on. But Monique went back to work with a steadier spine. Not louder, not harder, just more certain. Because what she had done wasn't just speak for Ernestine Powell. She'd held a mirror up to a room full of people and made them see what care really looked like. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would remember. That's all she'd ever wanted. She didn't need applause. She just needed to be heard. So the next time she walked down the hallway of St. Luke's, saline stains on her sleeves and exhaustion on her face, no one dared question the strength in her step. Respect didn't come from robes or titles. It came from showing up, again and again, even when no one clapped. Even when no one watched. Monique Ellis had shown up. And in doing so, she'd quietly reminded a courtroom and a city what service really means. Sometimes, the strongest voices don't come from podiums or press conferences. They come from tired feet in worn-out shoes, from quiet hands that never stop working, and from people like Monique Ellis, who show up not because it's convenient, but because it's right. This story wasn't about a courtroom victory or applause from the gallery. It was about one woman who refused to let silence win. A woman who knew that respect isn't about what you wear, but about how you carry the truth when no one else will. We live in a world that's quick to judge by appearances, titles, and decorum, especially in systems built on formality like the courtroom. But Monique's presence reminded us that dignity has nothing to do with polish and everything to do with purpose. When she walked into that courtroom wearing scrubs, tired, unpolished, and unapologetically real, she didn't just testify. She forced a room full of strangers to see beyond their expectations. And when she spoke, they listened. Here's the lesson: never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who shows up with compassion and truth in their hands. Whether you're a nurse, a janitor, a teacher, or someone just trying to do right in a world that often overlooks you, your integrity matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes, showing up as you are, with no pretense and no armor, is the most powerful thing you can do. To the viewers and listeners of U.S. Instructive Stories, thank you. Thank you for being here, for taking the time to hear stories like Monique's. These aren't just tales of justice, they are reminders of the quiet revolutions happening around us every day. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you know, a caregiver, a nurse, a neighbor who always puts others first, I hope you'll share it with them. Remind them that what they do matters. That being unseen doesn't mean being unworthy. And that even in the most rigid spaces, the truth still has the power to shift hearts. We are so grateful you joined us. On this channel, we don't chase spectacle, we tell the kind of stories that leave an imprint. Stories that remind us what courage, compassion, and real respect look like. From all of us at U.S. Instructive Stories, thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never be afraid to speak up for what's right, even if your voice is the only one in the room. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything.